Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Rancho, and these are my running back rankings for Week 15. We're always intended for half PPR on this channel, and it's the first week of the fantasy playoffs, the wild card round. It's a must-win unless you secured that bye. So let's get into this video. We're going to start with some charts and breakdowns of the position. This chart right here shows you the last 4 games and the points per game average for every running back in the NFL. It's the Recency Bias chart, how they've been performing over the last 4 weeks. And there's some clear outliers on this chart. There are 2 players who are by far and away above the rest. At number 1, we have Saquon Barkley, who, even though he only had 12 points last week, no touchdown, his numbers went up. 5 weeks ago, he had an even worse game than last week. So he's just been so dominant. 185 yards per game is what Saquon's averaging the last 4 games. Holy shit. That's an insane number from Saquon. But this next player is Josh Jacobs at number 2, averaging 23 plus points. He has 8 touchdowns over the last 4 games, 3 last week. Now a guarantee to find the end zone, if not once, at least twice. The next player is a decent drop-off, though. There's kind of another tier here. The top 10 is a bit different than the top 2. But number 3 is Joe Mixon, averaging 19.3 points per game. Then we have Bijan Robinson averaging 19 points. He has lived up to that draft capital. And then Chase Brown at 18.4, followed by DeVon Achane at 17.6. Both players are averaging over 5 receptions per game. They're basically the new Austin Eckler in the NFL. But behind Achane, we have Bucky Irving, who was very injured last week, had a terrible game, but still averages top 10 numbers. He was on a heater before getting hurt. So that Tampa Bay backfield, very valuable. And we'll mention Rachaad in just a second. But right behind Bucky, we have both Lions running backs with Dave Montgomery at 17.2 and Jahmyr Gibbs at 17. The only reason Jahmyr Gibbs is behind Montgomery is because he fumbled and otherwise would average 17.5. But then there's kind of a drop-off. There's kind of a tier break between Jahmyr Gibbs and the next player on this list. It would be Kyren Williams at 15.1, who also has fumbled in the last month. But next on the list is Rachaad White, so 15 points for him almost, 14.9. And no matter what, that Tampa Bay running back 1 is clearly a must start. If Bucky is not healthy enough to go, Rachaad will be just fine. In his absence, Rachaad will be a must start. So really shocking numbers in that Tampa Bay backfield. But next player would be James Conner at 14.3, followed by Chuba Hubbard at 14.1. Jonathan Brooks did just go on IR last week. But next up is James Cook. Big letdown from him last week against the Rams. They scored over 40 points, and James Cook only gave you 4 fantasy points. Not even. So that was disappointing. Next up on the list is Tyrone Tracy, who's been very productive lately. A lot of volume for him. In the passing game, it does help a lot. But then we have Derrick Henry and Najee Harris, both tied at 12.7. And Derrick Henry, not quite the same player the last month, but he is coming off bye. It's a great matchup this week. I do rank Derrick Henry much higher than this. I'll get to him later in the video. But after Najee, we have Zack Charbonnet, who really only has 1 week as the starter. Last week was just so productive. Charbonnet, clearly a must start if Walker can't go again. But right behind him, Alvin Kamara, 12.2 points without a single touchdown. This represents his floor, but also represents a very capped ceiling. Even without Taysom Hill, he did get vultured by Kendre Miller last week. So a safe floor play, but kind of annoying as fuck with Kamara on the goal line. Behind him is Rico Dowdle, RB20 in these rankings. If you get 12 plus points, that's a top 20 running back. And I think as many of these players I just mentioned as possible in your lineup is the best way to have an advantage. I think if you can have a top 20 running back as your flex, you have a massive advantage. These next few players are still fine, but not quite the same. We have Aaron Jones at 11.7, a couple fumbles for him the last month. That's not helping. Tony Pollard at 11.6, kind of a weird backfield to predict, but still decent numbers from him. And then kind of a drop-off to Isiah Pacheco at 10.2. Half of these numbers were at the beginning of the season before he got hurt. So he hasn't been the same since coming back, but last week his volume did double. He had 14 rush attempts last week. So he's getting healthier, but behind him we have Jonathan Taylor tied with Nick Chubb, and neither player has been the best. Taylor a bit safer in terms of floor, but Chubb a lot more touchdown dependent. Taylor not scoring many touchdowns himself. And then Jaylen Warren at 9.7 is kind of like the last like high floor option. As it trickles down, you really lose a lot of value from player to player. We have DeAndre Swift at 9.1, Guerendo and Brian Robinson at 8.5, kind of touchdown dependent as well. Rhamondre Stevenson, Amir Abdullah, Sincere McCormick, Javonte Williams, Isaiah Davis, Travis Etienne, Justice Hill, and then everyone else is less than 6 points per game. And there are several players who I didn't rank due to injury as well. We have J.K. Dobbins was a top 15 running back. He's on IR. We have Breece Hall, probably not going to play. He's not ruled out for this season yet, but if I was running the Jets, I wouldn't put him back on the field. I don't rank him this week. I also did not rank Austin Eckler, who remains on IR. And then Kenneth Walker getting some tests done. I don't think will play. I think Charbonnet will get the start again. And then Christian McCaffrey did go on IR, averaging 10.1 points per game this season. Massive letdown from what you expected when drafting CMC. But then Alexander Mattison averaging 8.2 points per game. We'll see if he plays this week. And then lastly, Roschon Johnson dealt with a concussion last week. Maybe he misses another game, but at the moment, I didn't rank him. He probably suits up. Most players don't miss more than one game with a concussion. So that's the recency bias at the position. That's the chart I wanted to show you. But there's another chart I would like to mention as well. We go through the matchups, all of the upgrades and downgrades, and that's what this chart does represent. As you can see here right below me, this data point represents league average. It would be 20.1 points per game. That is league average. So if you get between 22 points and 18, I think that's a pretty average matchup, no upgrade or downgrade. Where I am interested is if you can get above 24 points. I think that's the gold zone. This tier, the top 9 matchups are all clearly more advantageous than the rest. So let's go through the upgrades here. The number 1 matchup would be Jacksonville. The Jags are going up against the Jets, and I don't think Breece Hall will suit up. So Isaiah Davis and Braelon Allen do get a big upgrade against Jacksonville if Breece Hall is ruled out one more time. But the biggest upgrade, probably the more important upgrading your lineup, would be for Derrick Henry, who does go up against the New York Giants. So that's really positive. Derrick Henry should pay off this week. And I think so will Isiah Pacheco against Cleveland. Over the last month, they do rank number 3. The Browns have allowed 8 touchdowns on the ground to running backs, 9 overall, but 8 on the ground. I think Pacheco is a very safe bet to find pay dirt, and perhaps Kareem Hunt in a revenge game also scores a touchdown. I hope he doesn't vulture him. I hope there's a touchdown for both of them, not just Kareem Hunt. So that is an interesting matchup. The next best one would be the Colts, but I think you kind of don't care about that. The Broncos have too big of a committee to really trust one player. So maybe you'll bet on Jaleel McLaughlin. Maybe you'll bet on Javonte Williams. Perhaps Audric Estime vultures both of them and screws us. I don't really trust the Broncos backfield this week, but the matchup is good. Perhaps it's just wasted on Denver. Next upgrade would be San Francisco, who get the Rams, so I definitely trust Kyren Williams this week. I also think Rico Dowdle gets a massive upgrade against Carolina. They rank top 6 over the last 5 weeks. However, on the season, the Panthers rank number 1 overall. So always a good spot. Any running back against Carolina deserves a massive upgrade in general. Next upgrade would be for Aaron Jones, who goes up against Chicago. The Bears have given up a lot of yards per game to the position. The last 2 that are clear and obvious upgrades, tied at 24.1 points per game, would be Green Bay, who go up against Zack Charbonnet. If Kenneth Walker's unavailable, then Charbonnet, definitely a must start. And then the Buffalo Bills, who go up against Detroit, are also an upgrade as well. So you were already starting Jahmyr Gibbs and Dave Montgomery, upgrade them even more than general. So the last one to mention is technically above 22 points, but it's almost in the average tier. 22.2 points allowed by the Rams. They do rank as the 10th best matchup, and perhaps that is an upgrade for the starting Niners running back. Maybe it's Guerendo if he's healthy enough. Maybe it's Patrick Taylor. I can't say for sure right now. I ranked Guerendo, but you want to monitor his practice reps. He's not fully healthy at the moment. So those are all the upgrades. I mentioned league average is 22 to 18 points per game, but then less than 18 points, I do think is a legit downgrade. I would be concerned about these matchups here I have circled. The worst one, the last matchup you want to get, would be against Detroit, who have been terrible in terms of matchups all season long. Last 5 games only giving up 12 points per game. And this number would be far lower if not for 3 rushing touchdowns given up to Jacobs last week. If you take that out of the equation, you're only getting about 8.5 points per game allowed by the Lions defense. So although they are very injured, not 100% at all, I don't feel great about James Cook or Ray Davis this week. Neither played well despite the Bills scoring over 40 points against the Rams last week. They were both bad options in fantasy against the Rams. So against Detroit, they could be even worse. I have some big red flags regarding James Cook this week, but next worst matchup is the worst on the season. The Chiefs still holding strong bottom 2, averaging 13.7 points per game allowed to opposing running backs. So bad matchup here for both Nick Chubb and Jerome Ford. They're in a sizable committee, and unless you get a touchdown from Chubb, he's never really worth starting in fantasy right now. So tough matchup there. Another bad matchup against the Vikings. They get Chicago, and I wouldn't feel great about starting DeAndre Swift or Roschon Johnson against the Vikings. They gave up a lot of yards and touchdown to both Algier and Bijan last week, but still they rank bottom 3. They were less than 10 points per game allowed last week on this chart. So those 3 are the most concerning, definitely a tier below the rest, but still I think at 15.5 points, the Texans should concern you a little bit. They get DeVon Achane, but with Raheem Mostert banged up, I don't worry about the volume for Achane, so I'd still be starting DeVon Achane. The next downgrade would be New England, and they get James Conner. The Patriots have not allowed a single rushing touchdown the last 5 games, so maybe Conner does not score a touchdown. I'm a bit concerned about that. Then the next downgrade would be Seattle, who go against Josh Jacobs. I wouldn't bench Jacobs. Even against Detroit, he scored 3 touchdowns. And then Tampa do get the Chargers this week. I don't think Gus Edwards or Kamani Vidal have earned any trust at this point. So not going to start them. Need a touchdown for Gus. Otherwise, it's nothing. And then Atlanta do get the Raiders this week. I doubt you're starting Sincere McCormick or Madison with any confidence. I think McCormick has earned the job in Las Vegas. But then Philly is probably the last other downgrade to mention. 17.3 points per game allowed. They get the Steelers, and that makes Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren hard to trust. In that committee, you really need a touchdown for it to work out. So those are the big downgrades. Technically, the Dolphins do rank bottom 10, but as I mentioned, 18 points is still considered league average, in my opinion. They get the Texans, and I'm not going to downgrade Joe Mixon, but I'll mention the matchup a little bit later on in the rankings. Let's get to those rankings. Starting with number 1, in my rankings, it's pretty obvious. It's Saquon Barkley, who's been by far and away the RB1. He's the only one who could challenge Josh Allen at this point for league MVP. I doubt it happens. It probably goes to the quarterback, but still Saquon is averaging 185 yards per game. That is insane. That's phenomenal usage for Saquon. So cannot bench him. He's clearly the RB1. And at number 2, I think you have to put Jacobs in this tier as well. Jacobs has 8 touchdowns the last month, with 3 last week, 3 2 weeks ago. I expect 1, if not 2, guaranteed from Jacobs. He will find the end zone. That is a lock to bet on. Number 3, I think we're dropping down a tier, but obviously these players are very safe as well. I have Bijan Robinson at number 3. Against the Raiders, they're going to dominate. I think they win very comfortably, and unlike last week against the Vikings, it's a pretty average matchup. He even played well against Minnesota, so a downgrade that should have been didn't really matter. Start Bijan no matter what. At number 4, I'm also starting Chase Brown no matter what. So many targets for him. He averages 5.8 receptions. And if you're playing in full PPR, you could rank him even higher. So Chase Brown, a true stud, the RB5 in points per game the last month, averaging 115 yards per game. He's money in the bank. He's basically this year's Austin Eckler. I think that role for him is really defined in the passing game. It's not going anywhere. Joe Burrow trusts him a lot. Chase Brown will pay off, guaranteed. At number 5, I'm upgrading Derrick Henry at the Giants. The King gets the second best matchup on paper this week. The Giants allow 120 rushing yards per game on 4.2 yards per carry, along with 7 touchdowns and 39 receiving yards per game. Those receiving yards probably go to Justice Hill. That's not really the role that Henry has in this backfield. But off the bye, I expect them to use him a lot. I think he finds the end zone easily and maybe even twice against the Giants. It should be a blowout win, and obviously Derrick Henry will get involved. He should find the end zone at least once. So he's also averaging 97 yards per game. If you get 100 yards and a touchdown, 16 plus points for Henry, that should be great. I think he'll be even better. I think he could go over 20 points in this matchup against the Giants. He should be good. My only concern is if he's benched in the fourth quarter and if Justice Hill happens to vulture him for like 2 fluke touchdowns. I really doubt that. I'm still trusting Derrick Henry, but that's the only way it wouldn't work out. So start him for sure against the Giants. I think you have to. At number 6, you're definitely not benching Joe Mixon, who's been the RB3 over the last month. With 5 touchdowns, though, it's a bit dependent on those touchdowns. Averaging 102 yards per game, that's kind of the same as Derrick Henry. He gets more work in the passing game, though, about 3 catches per game. But again, those touchdowns are pretty critical to him being top 3. And the Dolphins are not the best matchup. The Dolphins do rank bottom 10, giving up 18 points per game, technically league average, but at the bottom of that tier. They only give up 66 rushing yards per game on 3.7 yards per carry. On the ground, it's actually very difficult to run it against the Dolphins. But where I'm not concerned is in the passing game. League average is about 30 receiving yards per game, and the Dolphins rank top 3 in that department. They give up 49 receiving yards per game to running backs every week. So that's definitely an upgrade, and I do trust Mixon from a yards from scrimmage standpoint. They've also given up 3 receiving touchdowns. You may not run it in on the Dolphins, but you can catch it out of the backfield and score a touchdown against Miami. So I think Mixon will be fine, but the matchup is bottom 10. Meanwhile, Henry, his matchup is top 2, and that's why I do rank Mixon below Henry this week. The matchup is tougher against the Dolphins, but in the same matchup, I think you're also starting DeVon Achane no matter what. Achane is also trying to take the mantle as the new Austin Eckler away from Chase Brown. Achane has over 5 receptions per game as well, but he's not as efficient. He's getting less volume overall, and averaging 75 yards per game with 5 touchdowns makes him a little bit touchdown dependent as well. But he's been a stud, the top 6 running back in points per game, and you're not benching him. Achane should be fine, but the matchup is a bit concerning. I mentioned the downgrade against Houston. It's not ideal. They only give up 15.5 points per game, but given there's no other competition in his backfield at all, with Mostert banged up and Jaylen Wright not really emerging yet, I could see all 15.5 of those points going to Achane very easily. So he's a very safe play. I definitely trust him. I'm not going to bench him. It's a must win against Houston for the Dolphins to have any shot at the playoffs. They have to win this week. I would expect Achane to produce good fantasy numbers. So a top 10 play for sure, always the case with him. At number 7, I wouldn't bench him, even though the Texans are a bottom 4 matchup. At number 8 and 9, I have both of the Lions running backs who are always in your lineup. You cannot bench them at all. And it's just a question of which one will be slightly better than the other. But it's a pretty even split. I don't know if it's like by design, it probably is, but Detroit always gives an equal volume to both Gibbs and Montgomery. It's like one of you scores this touchdown, and then on the next drive, we'll give the touchdown to the other one. It's just a question of who is on the field at this point in time, and the next opportunity will go to the next guy. So I'm trusting both of them for sure. I view them both identically. Against the Bills, it's a top 9 matchup. I could be ranking them too low, but because they're both equally involved, it eats into their upside. They both have kind of a capped ceiling. You rarely get more than 20 points from either of these players unless they score multiple touchdowns. But in general, they always score at least 1 and usually give you at least 16 plus points guaranteed. I'd still be starting both Gibbs and Montgomery regardless. So you can't bench him. Don't get cute. Against Buffalo, could be a massive shootout. They're going to need to score. I definitely trust Gibbs and Montgomery. I almost ranked them both in the top 5, but given it's a split backfield, I kept them towards the bottom of the top 10. At number 10, I have Zack Charbonnet versus Green Bay, who's going to see a monster workload yet again. I do not think Walker will suit up. He's getting some imaging done. Some tests need to come back. We do not know for sure what the situation is. But I don't expect them to force him onto the field. I think they'll save him for the playoffs potentially because they have a very good backup running back right behind him. Charbonnet would be probably a top 15 fantasy running back if he was a starter on any other team, maybe even higher depending on the roster. But given he is the starter, I actually think he's more valuable than Walker would be, because when Walker's healthy and Charbonnet is as well, Charbonnet still gets like a third of the volume. Walker never gets like 90% of the touches. When Walker's out, that's what Charbonnet gets in this backfield. There's no backup behind him to threaten him for volume. Like Travis Homer caught a few targets, but Kenny McIntosh saw the only other rush attempt in this backfield. Charbonnet might come off the field for rest here or there, but in general, I think 20 plus touches is guaranteed, and he will see at least like 85, 90+% of the touches in this backfield. So you have to start him if he's on the field and Walker is not. Charbonnet will be a stud once again. And the matchup is top 8. The Packers give up 24 plus points per game on 82 rushing yards, 3.6 yards per carry. But where I'm excited, 6 touchdowns. I think it's very likely that Charbonnet does score a touchdown. And even better, the Packers allow 52 receiving yards per game. That's the second most to any running back position in the NFL. So really, really good spot here for Charbonnet in the passing game. And we know that role is clearly his. I believe he had 7 catches last week, and Walker usually was catching like 4 or 5 targets a game as well. You know, this offense checks it down to the running back every single week at a high rate. So Charbonnet is locked into the top 10. I see a very high floor. The ceiling's elite. You could argue that Charbonnet is a top 3 running back. Last week, he was as well. So love him this week. If you picked him up off of waivers or have just been stashing him for a long time, now's the time it's paying off in the fantasy playoffs. At least in week 15, Charbonnet is a stud, a top 10 play at the position. Number 11, we have Kyren Williams, who I think is the last player in this tier, who I also think you have to start no matter what. The RB10 the last month, and he does have a fumble. He could average even more than 15.1 points without the fumble. But with 92 yards per game and 4 touchdowns last month, he's getting back in the end zone, and that's very safe. I do trust him a lot. Against the Niners, it's also a top 5 matchup. The Niners give up 8 touchdowns over the last 5 games and 112 rushing yards as well, 23 receiving. I trust Kyren from a floor standpoint. I think he gives you at least 80 yards and a touchdown. I think he'll be great this week. Definitely trust him. I think he's a safe top 11 option in the must-start tier. Absolutely. So start him if you got him. Kyren has been paying off. The last few weeks, the touchdowns have come back. But number 12, I think we're dropping down a tier, and there's a little bit more risk, but still these players I think have earned start status this week. I would be starting these guys for sure. I have Rachaad White at number 12 at the Chargers, and it's a question of how healthy is Bucky Irving this week. If last week was an indication, then Rachaad will clearly be the go-to guy. Bucky left very early last week with back soreness, and Rachaad never looked back. So we've seen a lot of production. Bucky's averaging over 17 points last month, and Rachaad is averaging just under 15. So even without Bucky Irving, he would have great numbers on his own. If you know for a fact that Bucky's not really contributing, then you can kind of project like 20 plus points for Rachaad and not sound insane. He scored 2 touchdowns last week. It could easily happen again. Against the Chargers, though, it's not the best matchup you could ask for. They do give up 113 rushing yards per game, though, the last month. It could be worse. They used to be a lot tougher earlier in the season. They have given up a lot more yardage on the ground as of late. So I think Rachaad will be fine. I'm going to go to this game, and I'm a bit worried about him. He has 4 touchdowns the last month, and I think he absolutely scores at least 1 this week, assuming Bucky is not 100%, which is a pretty safe bet to make. I think they're not going to force it with Bucky. They have Rachaad, who's good enough to get it done on his own. So I trust him. I did rank Bucky. I think Bucky will still play, but that's not a guarantee. If you told me Bucky Irving doesn't suit up, I'd probably at least extend the previous tier to include Rachaad White. I might not move him up above any other players because I doubt you're benching anyone else, but Rachaad would be a clear must start if Bucky's not available. Even if he is, I still think Rachaad is top 12. Number 13, I have Isaac Guerendo versus the Rams. And while he is questionable, I think if he is active on Thursday night, you have to start him. He was a stud last week. He had 2 touchdowns. He had 50 yards receiving, over 70 rushing, and the volume could have been even better if he didn't come off the field in the fourth quarter. He had a foot injury, and that's why I'm concerned. He's not a safe bet to actually suit up. He's not practicing yet. The game is on Thursday, and perhaps that's why they're being cautious, perhaps why they took him out of the game early. They were blowing out the Bears, and given it's a short week, why force him to keep playing if he was at all in pain? So I'm hoping it was just caution why he was taken out of the game, but obviously the foot injury is a big concern, and it might lead to a bagel if he is ruled out. So if you have Guerendo, if you picked him up recently, then make sure he plays. He will be a game time decision, and if he's unavailable, you need to bench him. So that's not great. I wish he was active. I wish I knew for sure, but I think he'll suit up. I can't say for sure. If he does, I think you have to start him. He was just way too good last week. 128 yards on 17 touches, 2 catches with 2 touchdowns in not even 100% of the snaps. So I 100% would be starting Guerendo. The upside's just way too high. We've seen these backups in San Francisco always produce high numbers. So even 2 weeks ago, when there were some injuries with McCaffrey and Jordan Mason, he also scored a touchdown. Guerendo is a very valuable piece in fantasy. So hopefully he suits up. We'll get more clarity on Thursday. But if he is active, I think he is a top 15 play. Have to start Guerendo if healthy. Number 14, I think you also have to start Rico Dowdle at Carolina. The Panthers are the best matchup the entire season for opposing running backs. The last month, they're only number 6, but still a very positive outlook. And on the ground, I expect Rico Dowdle to dominate. The Panthers give up 6 yards per carry, 159 rushing yards per game. That's an insanely high number to give up on the ground. They also allow 34 receiving yards per game and 3 touchdowns the last 5 weeks. And you know all of this volume will go to Rico Dowdle. Maybe like 3 or 4 touches go to Zeke and Lupke combined, but Dowdle will get at least 80 to 85% of the volume. He is clearly their only weapon in that backfield. So it's almost all going to him. He's a clear workhorse, and with all of that volume against such a good matchup, the Panthers will not be able to stop him. Dowdle should be great in fantasy, a very bust-proof option next week. Such a big upgrade against Carolina. So you have to start him. I think 15 points on just yardage alone next week is not a bad projection at all. I think it's actually reasonable to expect that Rico gives you at least 120 yards on the ground. That's not insane to assume at all. So Rico Dowdle must start against Carolina. He should dominate and be very efficient. Number 15, in the very same game, I have Chuba Hubbard versus Dallas, who's going to get a monster workload next week because Jonathan Brooks was placed on IR. The rookie got hurt again, a knee injury, devastating to hear. But for Chuba, it's great for his outlook. Miles Sanders is also on IR, so no backup they bring in will threaten him at all. Chuba should probably see like 25 plus touches himself against the Cowboys. The matchup's nowhere near as good as the Panthers matchup, and that's why I do rank Dowdle above him. But in the same game, I expect both players to be very productive. I think Chuba finds the end zone and probably gives you 100 yards as well, but he has kind of underperformed a couple of times lately. He also has 2 fumbles, and perhaps that does burn you. So why I didn't rank him in the top elite tier is because of those fumbles, but I do expect a very, very high floor and usage level for Chuba, probably 25 touches, given there's no one else healthy in that backfield. I think Hubbard's a very safe play. I would be starting him this week against the Cowboys. At 16, kind of shocking to rank him this low, but Jonathan Taylor has not been the most productive the last month. Only the RB 24, tied with Nick Chubb at 10 points per game. So that's a big letdown. Only 1 touchdown in the last month for him. 80 yards on over 21 touches. Very inefficient numbers from Taylor. And the fact he plays with Richardson is a kind of a liability. You could get vultured on the goal line and not be shocked. Taylor also doesn't catch any passes from Richardson, and that's kind of the only upside of this matchup. The Broncos do rank league average in terms of running back matchups, but they only give up 66 rushing yards per game. That's really low. However, in the passing game, they give up the most yards overall to the position, an average of 57 receiving yards per game to opposing running backs. So that's where Taylor could exploit it. However, you need Richardson to actually throw him the ball for it to matter, and that's why I'm concerned. Denver has given up 5 touchdowns the last 5 games, but 3 of them are in the passing game, and we already know that Richardson vultures him pretty consistently. So if Richardson does not check it down to Taylor, Taylor will bust. I think Taylor's actually very risky this week because of the matchup only benefiting pass catching running backs. So I'm a bit concerned, but Taylor's kind of bust proof. The name value is really high. Off the bye week, I expect him to be heavily involved in the game plan. I doubt they're not going to use their best player in a must-win situation. The only chance the Colts have to make the playoffs is if they win this game. There's now tiebreakers that open up if they win against not only Denver, but also the Texans if they somehow catch them if they win out. So the Colts are going to play lights out this week. I think Taylor's going to be a fine play, but this matchup against Denver does concern me. There's a world where he does not pay off. Taylor has not been great the last month. So good luck, but I think if you have him, I would start him. I think he does find the end zone. I think Taylor will be fine, but I can't say for sure. That's why I only have him at 16. A little riskier than I would have thought. At number 17, I have Bijan Robinson Jr. at New Orleans, who shockingly only averages 8.5 points per game. That's running back 28 on a per game basis. The last month, he has been kind of rough, but injuries have played a big role in that. And he is coming off a bye, so I expect him to be rested and healthy. I expect the volume to be there for Bijan Robinson, especially because Eckler is still on IR. Even if Robinson gets vultured by Jeremy McNichols, I think his role in the passing game is going to be way too high to ignore. I expect like 4 or 5 plus targets for Robinson this week at the Saints. Maybe there's too much garbage time and bad game script for that to happen. I could be wrong. But if that's the case, then Robinson probably finds the end zone in the process. So I think he's a good play. If Eckler's unavailable, I think you have to trust Bijan Robinson. The Cliff Kingsbury running back always scores a touchdown. And if Eckler's not there, the volume will be way too high for B-Rob to bench. So I would start him. The matchup's an average one, so no downgrade. I think the volume is why I'm trusting him. Robinson should be fine, a top 20 play this week. But at number 18, I'm a bit concerned about James Cook at Detroit. This game probably is a shootout, but last week was against the Rams, and he was really bad. He barely got any work, and Josh Allen just kind of did it all himself. Ty Johnson scored the only running back touchdown. It was a 50-plus yard reception, and you would have loved to see that go to James Cook instead. But odds are it doesn't repeat. I still trust Cook from an upside standpoint. He normally finds the end zone, and although last week was concerning, I'm not going to overreact, but I am very concerned about this matchup. This is the main reason why I'm downgrading him. The Lions are the worst matchup on paper, only giving up 12 points per game and a total of 64 yards per game to the position. That is terrible efficiency. Overall, I could be very wrong about this ranking. Cook could burn you, and I wouldn't be too shocked. So there's kind of a drop-off once we exit the top 15. I think Taylor, Bijan Robinson, and James Cook are a little concerning, but based on name value, to actually bench them kind of feels stupid. I think they're still going to offer top 20 numbers. I think they will go over 12 points pretty reliably, but there is a world where it doesn't pay off. The Lions matchup is a big downgrade normally, so good luck there, but I think if you have Cook, I doubt you're going to bench him. I would still expect a good game from James Cook. But at number 19, it's a shame that he doesn't score touchdowns because Kamara could be a true stud in fantasy. He's averaging 12.2 points per game, which is running back 19 on a per game basis. I rank him here at number 19. But Kamara doesn't have a single touchdown in that span. He has 4.5 catches on 23 touches per game, 99 yards per game. His floor is 12 points. He is a very safe play every week, but never finds the end zone. Not anymore. So with Taysom Hill gone, we expected him to find the end zone last week. He was vultured by Kendre Miller, and that was annoying as fuck. If it happens again, you would not be surprised at all. So I thought he'd be out of the doghouse, finally find the end zone last week. It didn't happen, and I don't think that's going to change. I really have a hard time trusting Kamara on the goal line because it's so obvious that the ball is going to go to him. He's clearly their best weapon. You need the element of surprise in the red zone, and that definitely applies to guys like Kendry or Juwan Johnson a lot more than Kamara. So I don't think he finds the end zone. I really don't want to bet on that. If he does, you'll be ecstatic. It'll be great. He'll be a top 10 play this week, but I just don't expect it. That's why I only have him at 19, where he averages in terms of points per game the last month. Number 20 is very interesting. It's Isiah Pacheco at Cleveland, who is not 100%. The volume did uptick last week. It went up to 14 rush attempts, but still he did not find the end zone, and that's what he needs to really pay off. This matchup, though, is top 3. It could really work out. The Browns have given up 9 touchdowns to the position, 8 on the ground, over the last 5 games. So the odds are pretty high that at least 1, if not 2 touchdowns are available in this backfield. I think Pacheco should find the end zone, but because Kareem Hunt has a revenge game and is still involved, I do have some concerns he gets vultured, and that would be very, very frustrating if it happened. But because the numbers are so good, even if Kareem Hunt does score, we could get a second touchdown available for Pacheco. I still think he's a good start. So I would start him at number 20. I think he will go over 12 points. While maybe he doesn't go over like 70 yards, I think a touchdown would put him over 13. So I like Pacheco this week. I think he's a good play. Because the matchup is very good, I think he will find the end zone. If he doesn't, you may get burned. Probably, though, safe for 7 or 8. Like, that's not going to completely obliterate your lineup, but in the playoffs, it could be the difference between a win and a loss. That touchdown is pretty critical. I'd be comfortable betting on it just because the Browns give up so many. Number 21, I have Aaron Jones versus Chicago, who is also the running back 21 in points per game the last month, and that includes 2 fumbles. So he could be even better, and I doubt it happens again. But if it does, you maybe won't be shocked. 3 fumbles in the last 5 weeks would suck. But I think he'll be fine. The matchup against Chicago does rank top 7, and they do give up 124 rushing yards on the ground, along with 43 in the passing game. So I think Jones will be very effective, very efficient, and probably go over 100 yards from scrimmage. They also give up 5 touchdowns over the last 5 games, and odds are Jones will score as well. He has 3 touchdowns the last 4 weeks, and I doubt Cam Akers vultures him. Jordan Addison and Jefferson, though, did score 5 touchdowns. It could all go to the receivers once again. So that's the only risk, but I think against Chicago, I'd be comfortable betting on Jones. I think from a floor standpoint, he will be fine, but the only reason I didn't rank him any higher is because of those fumble concerns. I would hate to get a fumble in the fantasy playoffs. That would really suck to lose 2 points in a critical matchup. So that's my concern. When it did happen, he also kind of was in the doghouse, didn't get many touches after that. It could really suck if it happened again, but I wouldn't bet on it. I still think Jones is safe. He's still in this high-end running back 2 tier. I still think 12 plus points is a safe projection for Aaron Jones. But at number 22, I'm actually very concerned with James Conner this week versus New England, and I could envision less than 10 points from him against the Patriots because they have not given up a single rushing touchdown in the last 5 games. They have given up 3 receiving touchdowns, but last week was James Conner's only receiving touchdown on the season. He rarely scores in that fashion. So if it doesn't happen this week, if they only give him goal line rush attempts, I could easily see the Patriots holding him out of the end zone. That's what they've done for well over a month. So not the easiest matchup here. It does rank bottom 5, and that touchdown is pretty critical for James Conner. He's averaging 14.3 points per game the last month. However, it does include 2 touchdowns, and in the 2 games where he doesn't find the end zone, he does not go over 10 points. So if it doesn't happen this week against New England, he could be a liability. Just a floor play for roughly 8 or 9 is a safe floor to expect, but I have a hard time believing he actually gets that touchdown. So the odds are pretty low. It's not impossible, but I'm not giving him that extra 6 point in terms of projection. If you told me for sure it would happen, I'd probably rank him alongside Chuba Hubbard, Jonathan Taylor, Rico Dowdle. James Conner would be a much better play if I could tell you for sure that touchdown would hit. But I do not think it happens this week. I actually did pick the Patriots. Maybe I'm biased, but this is one of the reasons why I'm confirming that opinion. So rough on Conner, a legit downgrade versus New England. They have been rough to score touchdowns on. Moving forward, I think we're dropping down a tier, and Tyrone Tracy is a really productive player, the RB15 over the last month, but against Baltimore, I have some concerns. They have really stepped up their defense, especially on the ground, over the last few weeks. So the Ravens used to be a good matchup in general. Now they're just league average. But Tyrone Tracy could still play very well. He is the RB15 in points per game the last month, averaging 13.1 on 16 touches. He usually also catches passes. Last week he had a lot of targets, and if that continues, he should be fine. So at RB23, I may be underestimating him a little bit too much, but he also has 2 fumbles the last month, and that's what I'm really hoping doesn't happen. If he fumbles just like Aaron Jones, you'd be livid, and I would hate it. So against Baltimore, I'm kind of hesitant to fully trust it. I think he's just a flex play, not a clear RB2. At number 23, though, I still think 10 points is probably a safe projection for Tyrone Tracy. So a decent floor play, maybe not the best. Go ahead and start him, but at 23, you may be able to do better in your lineup. At number 24, I got Najee Harris at Philly, who gets a bottom 10 matchup. The Eagles are hard to score on no matter what position you're playing, but with Jaylen Warren also in this backfield, I have some legit concerns about the Steelers running backs this week. I just don't trust who will score the touchdown, and against Philly, it's not a safe bet in general. They only give up 3 touchdowns the last 5 games, and only 81 yards on the ground, 32 receiving yards. I think Najee is pretty touchdown dependent. I would not trust him. I'd rather bench him if I could. Against the Eagles, it's just not a safe bet. Without a touchdown, you will not go over 10. So I'm probably going to pass on Najee. I just don't like the matchup or the committee with Jaylen Warren. At number 25, I had a hard time ranking Bucky Irving here. At the Chargers, I think if he's healthy, he is an interesting flex because he's been so good the last month. He's tied with Dave Montgomery despite a terrible game last week. 17.2 points is still his average. So a lot of upside if healthy, but I don't think he is. I think he might not even suit up. We could get a clear workhorse role for just Rachaad White. Even Sean Tucker was better than him last week. So Bucky is a bit of a liability. You need to monitor the practice reps. But if he is ever upgraded to full in practice, I'd probably swap him with Rachaad White. I'd probably rather start Bucky if I do know he practices in full by Friday. So monitor that situation. There's a chance he doesn't play at all, but there's a chance he is healthy and good to go. And if he is, I'd rather go with him than Rachaad. I think he is better, more talented, but at the moment, if he's not healthy enough, I'd rather pass. We'll see what happens. Later in the week, I will update this ranking. On Saturday, I'll give you the final version. But at 26, I have Tony Pollard versus the Bengals. Obviously, Pollard's a bit risky, and last week, it was a far better matchup. So I wouldn't trust him like crazy. I think he's a bit of a liability, but he could find the end zone. The Bengals do usually give up a rushing touchdown every single week. Number 27, I have Rhamondre Stevenson at Arizona, and he could pay off. A touchdown would really offer him some high upside, but he has not scored in a month, and he has fallen down to RB30, only averaging 7.8 points per game in that span. So the volume's always kind of high for him, 18.5 touches per game, but without a touchdown, you will get screwed. Rhamondre is interesting, but not my favorite bet. I'm probably going to pass on Rhamondre. But at 28, Tank Bigsby, also very interesting, had 18 carries last week. Etienne was relegated to just a pass-catching role. So Bigsby's healthy now. It looks like he is back to being their best running back, but with no PPR value against the Jets, I'm not too excited. I would rather pass. He's still only averaging 31 yards per game last month, but injuries have played a big factor there. Bigsby would be my favorite start in Jacksonville in that backfield, but I don't feel great about it. It's still a bit more of a committee, too much of a committee for me to trust. But another committee that's hard to bet on would be the Jets backfield. Isaiah Davis and Braelon Allen come in here back to back at RB 29 and 30 in my rankings. I think Isaiah Davis is a bit more safe to find the end zone, but the volume probably slightly favors Braelon Allen. Last week, though, was almost a 50-50 split, and you probably started the wrong one with Braelon Allen, but he was okay. He was fine. Isaiah Davis, though, has 2 straight games of the touchdown, and against Jacksonville, it is a very good matchup. They give up 6 touchdowns to the position, but also 142 rushing yards on 4.9 yards per carry and 36 receiving yards. That's 180 per game on average. So really good floor available for both players, but I really don't trust a ton of volume for either guy. They could both get 12 touches, and if only one scores a touchdown, you could easily start the wrong option, just like last week. So I'm not dying to start these players, but if you are in a jam, if you have to replace Breece Hall and they were the only guys off the waiver wire, go ahead. I think I'd actually rather go Isaiah Davis than Braelon Allen. I don't think it's a wide margin. I could be wrong about that, but based on the touchdown production, Isaiah Davis has been better the last 2 games. At number 31, I have Jaylen Warren at Philadelphia, and I'm very concerned about this matchup. The Eagles, hard team to play against, and touchdowns are very critical. Even though Warren was like torching Cleveland last week, he didn't score a touchdown and didn't go over 9 points. So Warren wasn't great. He was just, a safe floor play, and that's kind of what you're getting from him every week. You're getting about 70 yards from Warren and a couple catches, 8-9 points. He rarely does better than that without a touchdown. So against the Eagles, I'd rather bet against it. It could easily go to Najee or neither of them, and it's just a bit too much of a liability to trust. So bad matchup. I'm going to bench Jaylen Warren. There's no teams on bye, so he's not a player that you have to start just because you don't have better options. But at 32, the last player I think is in the flex conversation that I'd be interested in starting if I needed to is DeAndre Swift at Minnesota. He is a starting running back, so that is something, but Roschon Johnson probably plays, not dealing with a concussion for the second week in a row. That's unlikely, and he could get vultured easily on the goal line. DeAndre Swift is not 100% healthy at all. He barely practiced last week, and while he was on the field, he was not efficient at all, only like 40 yards from scrimmage. So not expecting a lot. The Vikings are a terrible matchup, bottom 3 at the moment, and DeAndre Swift should be very inefficient against them. I doubt he finds the end zone. I think odds are he probably gets vultured by Roschon before he scores himself. So I'd rather pass. I think maybe I should bump him down below the tier break, but given he is a starter, there is still that aspect of upside to factor in. So at 32, I'm probably going to bench DeAndre Swift, but he's the last guy I'd probably be comfortable starting if I was desperate enough and just needed 8 points as a floor. But moving forward, I'm not expecting 8+ points from any of these players. And at 33, Travis Etienne is kind of interesting. He had 4 targets, 4 catches last week. He did have 9 points thanks to like 50 receiving yards, but still I don't feel great about him. He only had 8 total touches and Bigsby had 18. So Etienne is behind Bigsby in this backfield. While he's still a talented player, I don't trust him. The volume is not safe enough. I would be benching Etienne for sure. I just don't feel good about the volume at all. Number 34 and 35, I have both of the Broncos running backs. I have Jaleel McLaughlin, 1 spot above Javonte Williams. And last time we saw these two players, Jaleel was way more efficient, had way more volume. Before the bye week, it looked like Javonte may have lost his job, but maybe it was just the matchup against Cleveland. So I don't know what you're going to get. The Colts matchup is top 4, but it is wasted here. I have no confidence in trusting a Broncos running back in my lineup. You're going to need a touchdown. I think if you had to bet, it would go to McLaughlin, and he actually has almost an equal amount of touches as Javonte. Jaleel, the last 4 games, averaging 7 touches per game. Javonte averaging 7.8. So it is starting to pivot in favor of McLaughlin, who also averages 40 yards per game. Javonte only 26. I do think Jaleel is the safer play, but it's just too much of a gamble. It could go to Estime, and we'd be screwed. So no thanks there. I'm going to pass, but if you're willing to press your luck, it is a good matchup. The Colts do allow 25 points per game on 110 rushing yards, 4.5 yards per carry, 7 running back touchdowns, and also 34 receiving yards per game. There's a lot of points available in this matchup. I just don't know exactly where they're going to go. That's why I'll pass. At 36, Justice Hill gets a great matchup, and Derrick Henry rarely catches passes. The Giants give up 39 receiving yards per game. That is well above league average, and Justice Hill could capitalize. If he also vultures a touchdown, you probably go over 10 points with Hill, and maybe if you're super desperate, he's one of the backups you're going to consider as a flyer. But odds are it's too risky. I would probably bench him, but I'd rather go Justice Hill against the Giants than I would Nick Chubb versus the Chiefs. The Chiefs are a terrible matchup, the worst all season long, and Chubb is super touchdown dependent. He's in a big committee with Jerome Ford lately, and I do not trust him for more than 40 yards in any given game. So Nick Chubb, very touchdown dependent. I don't think it happens against the Chiefs. I'd rather bench him. Terrible matchup to trust against. So no thank you with Nick Chubb. I'm definitely going to bench him. And I'm also going to bench Gus Edwards versus Tampa Bay. Another starting running back that I just don't trust. Gus is never catching passes. He's also very inefficient. And if he doesn't score a touchdown, you will not get more than 6 points. Gus is never going to go over 60 yards. Even if he gets like 15 carries, that almost never happens from Gus. So you need the touchdown against Tampa. Maybe it happens. They are a bottom 10 matchup, only 3 touchdowns allowed the last 5 games, and I'd rather bet against it. Even if Gus does find the end zone, he probably doesn't go over 10 points. Like that's what happened last week against the Chiefs. He was shit. So no thank you with Gus Edwards. I will pass. Hyper touchdown dependent and no upside, even if he does end up scoring. At 39, the last starting running back in the NFL is technically Sincere McCormick versus Atlanta, but I could be wrong. Maybe Madison is healthy enough to get the start again. He didn't play last week. McCormick had all the touches, and it looks like McCormick is well overtaken Amir Abdullah already. McCormick, a no-name guy just a couple weeks ago, is getting 6.9 points per game on 12 touches, 1.3 receptions, 62 yards per game, and no touchdown. The last 3 games filling in for Madison and Jahmyr White. And Jahmyr is on IR, so I do see McCormick as the guy. Even if Madison's healthy, I think he will get the most volume in this backfield. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't want to trust it. The Raiders' backfield has never had much value. Also, hyper touchdown dependent. The matchup's also bottom 10, so no thank you at all. This is the cutoff point. I'm definitely benching these players moving forward. But I do think there's an interesting tier here in terms of touchdown vulture potential. I could see a touchdown go to Kareem Hunt in a revenge game against Cleveland. The Browns have allowed 9 touchdowns to running backs over the last 5 games, and we know that Pacheco is not 100% at this moment in time. So Kareem Hunt, an interesting flyer. I'd rather only trust him in DFS, though. In the fantasy playoffs, I doubt I'll start Kareem Hunt. If he does score a touchdown, though, that would suck for Pacheco. Number 41, another guy who could vulture a touchdown would be Roschon Johnson, and I'd probably rather bet on it going to Roschon than Swift in that backfield. Roschon has more touchdowns in the last few weeks. So Roschon's interesting, but without the touchdown, even with it, kind of like Gus Edwards, you probably won't go over 10 points, so no thanks with him. And then at 42, probably the most critical acquisition off of the waiver wire would be Patrick Taylor versus the Rams. He might be the starting running back for San Francisco if Guerendo is not healthy. So Patrick Taylor, go ahead and scoop him up on waivers tonight. You have to get him. He could be a great play, but obviously a very big liability. Hard to trust a no-name guy like Taylor against the Rams in a plug-in spot in the fantasy playoffs. So good luck there. It's a good matchup, though. It could really pay off. Guerendo was elite last week. Taylor could just get all that volume immediately. Number 43, Ray Davis, who put up a bagel last week against the Rams. Pretty shocking. They scored 42 points, and only Ty Johnson had a good game in fantasy at running back. But Ray Davis could bounce back. It probably is another shootout against Detroit, so maybe he is interesting. But at 44, Tyler Algier had a good game last week against Minnesota. Could do it again against Las Vegas, but not enough volume to trust. Kendry Miller vultured a touchdown from Kamara last week. That sucked for Kamara, but Kendry maybe has a shot with this new coach. He's not as hated as he was by Dennis Allen. At 46, the last guy in this tier would be Blake Corum, who has been getting more volume, but not enough to trust. Perhaps he does vulture Kyren Williams. The Niners matchup is pretty good on the ground. And then lastly, these last 4 guys I'm definitely benching, but who knows, maybe have some value. Alexander Madison could be the guy instead of Sincere McCormick. It is possible, but I'm not going to start him given he's missed a lot of weeks. I don't think he's healthy enough. But Cam Akers sometimes vultures Aaron Jones, and maybe in garbage time against Chicago, it does crop up again. Jerome Ford is in a pretty significant time split with Nick Chubb, but Chubb scores the touchdown, so Ford does not have upside in that regard. And then lastly, Audric Estimate number 50, maybe off the bye, is the main running back in Denver. I could see it happening. I doubt it. I'd rather bet on Jaleel and Javonte, but given he's there, that's why I don't trust those other players enough to start. So those are my running back rankings this week. Here are the top 40 at the position here on the screen. And I feel really good about the top 11, but honestly, I feel like that elite tier, that blue line, could be extended all the way to Chuba Hubbard. I expect a very good game from guys like Rachaad White, Rico Dowdle, and Chuba Hubbard, as well as Guerendo, if he's healthy. But there are a few risk factors with those 4 players why I did not put them in the tier above, but I expect a very high output from all of them. They should go over 90 yards and a touchdown this week. That is my projection for the top 11, at least 15 points in fantasy. But Jonathan Taylor through James Conner, the top 22, I think are all still players I would expect to go over double-digit fantasy points. However, with a guy like Conner, I do have some concerns he doesn't find the end zone. And the same applies to guys like Tyrone Tracy, Najee Harris, and Bucky Irving, Tony Pollard, Rhamondre Stevenson. So we're in the flex conversation. I think once we hit Tank Bigsby, Isaiah Davis, we're a bit more touchdown dependent, but still all the way through DeAndre Swift, I would project at least 8+ points. They're safe floor plays if you just need someone at the flex. Maybe you're replacing Kenneth Walker or Breece Hall, and that's your best option. But once we hit Travis Etienne, it's a very risky proposition. There is still upside. Any of those players could score a touchdown, but without it, they will not go over 10. You'd be very screwed with those options. So that is it. Those are my running back rankings this week. Obviously, the top two, Saquon and Jacobs, are in a tier of their own. But that's it for me. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. My name's Adam Riancho, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.